tarde a todos. Espero que tenham aproveitado todas as aulas da manhã. Foi um bloco realmente construtivo, com palestras de alta qualidade. Então, eu gostaria de receber todos de volta, dar as boas-vindas para esse bloco da tarde. Para os que não estavam de manhã, então, sejam bem-vindos ao nosso congresso, o 5º Congresso da Huntington. Eu quero reforçar as palavras acolhedoras, de todos que iniciaram o congresso, do Eduardo Gonzalez, Eduardo Mota, João Pedro, acolhendo todos vocês, falando que nós estamos muito felizes por todos estarem presentes. Essa sala cheia nos enche de orgulho. E queria mais uma vez reforçar o papel da comissão organizadora, a Lígia, o Maurício, a Aline. Nós, da comissão científica, fizemos uma grade voltada mais para assuntos inovadores e que possam realmente construir o aprendizado de todos. Então, para começar esse bloco da tarde agora, eu convido o Dr. Michael Alper. Dr. Alper is co-founder of Boston IVF USA. He's double board certified in obstetrics, in gynecology, reproductive endocrinology, and fertility by the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and a clinical associate professor at Harvard Medical School, USA. Please, Dr. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to the organizing committee and those that put this wonderful course together. This is an unusual topic, safety in IVF, lessons from aviation. What does this have to do with reproductive medicine? Well, I'm a very lucky person because I've achieved 2 dreams in my life. One is to be a doctor, and the other is to be a pilot. And I love them both. And I've been very fortunate to learn some of the benefits that aviation thinking can bring to reproductive practice. So in this very short talk, I hope that when you leave here, you'll understand what CRM is, Crew Resource Management. I hope you understand what a sterile cockpit is. It's not what you think. And something about checklists and handoff errors. So when I was training to be an OBGYN, I took a flight in a small plane with a friend, and from that moment on, I had the virus. I was hooked to aviation. And I got my pilot's license, 40 years ago. I fly a lot, and I've been very fortunate to have experience in many different kinds of airplanes. And it's also a personal thing. This is my wife, my 2 little boys, Robert and Daniel. We took trips all over the place in planes and enjoyed it very much. We all have the right to influence our children. And this is an example of my poor son, Robert, who's now 28 years old. He had to become a pilot, as you can see, and he is a pilot now as well. But I want to bring up something you may not be aware of. Death from medical errors is very common. There's a study that's about 10 years old now that really addressed this issue, and it really shocked me that if you're admitted to a hospital, you have a 1% chance, 1 in 100 chance of dying as a result of a medical error. A very, very high number. And that results in 210,000 deaths every year in the United States, and you can translate this to any country in the world. It's just mind-boggling. Medical errors are the 3rd most common cause of death in the United States. There's 210,000 deaths every year from medical errors. It's really astonishing. And when you compare it to some other causes of death, the chance of dying in an airplane crash is 1 in 11 million. Not 1%, but 1 in 11 million. So And here's some other examples of different risks associated with certain activities. This is amazing if you think about it. If there were as many people dying from jet airplane crashes every year, there'd be 4 jet airplane crashes every single day to equal the number of people dying from medical mistakes. Now, if I asked you in the audience, when was the last airline accident that you remember where people died? You'd have to think. It's a long time ago. But this is a picture of all the airplanes over the United States. There's 30,000 takeoffs and landings every single day in the United States. And of course, the same thing in Brazil. If this is just an example of all the airplanes flying at one moment in Brazil, and you never hear of an accident. How is this possible? These airplanes are flying at 30,000 feet where the temperature is minus 55 degrees Celsius. And there's no oxygen to speak of. And you don't hear any accidents. How is that possible? And here's another example. If you've asked the question, how many people died in the world from an aircraft accident? In 2021, only 176 people died. You compare that to 8,900,000 deaths from heart disease. Now, how is that possible? This is so safe. Well, it's not an accident that it's safe. There's very little data on IVF or reproductive medicine, but you can see here there's 6 deaths reported from IVF from various complications, just to give you some metric. So the question for today is, why is aviation so much safer than medicine? Aviation is, as I pointed out, very complicated. You look at what's inside an airplane, all the parts, all the different aspects to keep the pressurization, the temperature, the engines running, etc. It's so complicated, and it has to interface with a human pilot. So you have human errors, you have mechanical errors, and as you know, human errors are the main cause of aircraft accidents, and it's the main cause of medical accidents also. So one of the advantages I've had is that the lessons I learned in aviation, I was able to bring back into medicine and incorporate some of them at Boston IVF, our practice in the States. So I just want to touch on a few things because it's a short time that we have today. Let's talk about errors. The definition of an error is the propensity for a certain common mistake by people. People make errors, and making an error is a normal process, and it occurs everywhere. Except if you're the medical director of the perfect IVF center, Mr. Perfect, perfect IVF, you don't have mistakes, or you don't talk about them. But you have to be honest. Everyone in this audience who works in an IVF center knows that mistakes are made. It's a question of how we deal with them. To say that your lab never makes a mistake is just not true. It happens all the time, but it's how you deal with these mistakes that I think is very critical, and you have to have a process. So, just a few points I want to make. The first thing is, when a mistake happens, how do you handle that mistake in your center? You should have a written process and an idea of how it's handled. In the aviation world, if there's an accident, the government agencies do a very thorough evaluation. It's public information. A very detailed report is made, and it's available to everybody. Why? So that we can learn from it, so it doesn't happen again. I don't know if this happens in IVF centers, but that's the way the aviation industry has evolved over time. So when it comes to errors, this is a whole subject to discuss in and of itself, but if I had to highlight the important facts, is when an error occurs, you have to investigate, you have to get all the facts together, you have to get everybody involved. It has to be non-personal, because usually when somebody makes a mistake, they feel terrible. And you have to obviously take that into account and reassure the person. You have to discuss it with your staff in an anonymous way. The worst mistake you can make is if somebody makes an error and tries to put it under the carpet, doesn't want to admit to it or doesn't report it. That, in my view, is the biggest mistake you can make, is not being honest about your mistakes. So at Boston IVF, what we put together was, we call it a non-conformance database. Non-conformance is just a fancy word for mistake. It's our mistake database, if you will. And we keep track of every error that was made. And we have a software program that keeps track of it, and we can follow it over time. Because mistakes happen, and fortunately, most of them are minor. Wrong date of birth on a form or something like that. But what we do is we take all these mistakes and we follow them over time to make sure the trend is good. We also categorize them as minimal, moderate, significant, or extreme errors. Now, fortunately, we haven't had an extreme error, but an extreme error would be wrong sperm, wrong egg, wrong embryo. It can happen, and we know it happens. We call that extreme. A significant error would be one like forgetting to check off ICSI, and the patient goes through IVF and has no fertilization. So a canceled cycle, bad thing to happen. You have to usually do another cycle at no cost for the patient, etc. That's a significant error. But we follow these over time. And just to give you, we wrote an article about this in Human Reproduction. If you look at moderate errors, we found that they occur at almost 4 a year. Don't forget, a procedure, there could be 4 or 5 procedures in an IVF cycle. There could be ICSI, there could be biopsy, the assisted hatching, whatever. So there's more than one procedure per IVF cycle, but we had significant errors in 1 in 16,000 procedures. Now, what about the other things that you can learn from aviation to try to understand why aviation is so much safer than medicine? It's something called handoff. It so happens, what a handoff is you're passing information about the patient from one doctor to another or a doctor to a nurse. That's a very high-risk situation, which we all know, because 80% of errors occur related to handoff errors. And in fact, there's one study that showed that about 60% of doctors reported a patient being harmed by a poor handoff. So it's important to implement methods to prevent handoff errors, and we're going to talk about some of them, and they all come from the aviation world. Here's a very simple, silly example. One time I was doing an embryo transfer. I put the transfer catheter going through the vagina into the cervix, and I said something, I forget exactly what I said, okay. The embryologist I said, okay, inject, but I wasn't even in the uterus. So she injected the embryo in the vagina. And I said to myself, that was my fault. I didn't communicate very well to the scientists when to press on the syringe. So we have a detailed protocol on what you should say. You should say inject, take the catheter, whatever your terminology is, should be very clear communication, not something vague like okay. I want to introduce something called crew resource management, which is probably the biggest reason for the improved safety in aviation. And we should incorporate that same philosophy in how we conduct ourselves in medicine. Crew resource management, what it is very simple. Every pilot of every airplane in the world has to train on crew resource management every year. Every year they have to. So what is this that they're training on? They're training on how to talk to each other and how to be clear in communication. Because so many accidents have been reported related to misunderstandings between 2 pilots in the cockpit. Here's a simple example. You want to be clear. So, Captain, I need your attention. So I'm talking to my co-pilot. We have a fuel problem. We do not have enough fuel to get around this weather. Let's divert to another airport. Do you agree, Captain? It's clear. Nothing in there that's vague. Not, you know, we may have a problem. I'm not sure. You know, it's very clear. And this is how we train as pilots.
ABC 6 News at 5, on your side.
A program at Mount Carmel that checks and counterchecks everyone's work is making a difference in patient care. ABC 6 health reporter Susan Burton explains in tonight's Strides in Medicine.
Jessica Olcheski is expecting a baby in 6 months, and she knows how she wants to be treated on that big day.
I should be the focal point, and the baby should be the focal point. So really just direct communication, I think, is important.
Her request is granted. A program now in place called Crew Resource Management is a system focused on patient safety. It uses the same guidelines developed by the airline industry, the cross-checks and checkpoints. Mount Carmel OBGYN Dr. Karana says it has improved communication skills in team building in the hospital, especially when the staff changes shifts, which is referred to as handoff.
The process of handoff and also evaluating data and conveying that data to the next team who is taking care of the patient has markedly improved the safety.
The patient and their family are also involved in the bedside reporting and handoff of care.
They all understand what's going on, and this has always advocated better for the safety of both mother and infant.
The process puts Jessica at ease.
I just think that's very important from a patient perspective.
So this is not new. This is something that's practiced in aviation, and it's the major reason why safety has improved so much. Now, another thing, sterile cockpit. You probably have no idea what that is, but I'm going to tell you. A sterile cockpit is not talking about things when you're trying to focus on something. You know, you're doing an egg retrieval, it's very difficult, the patient's moving around, and the nurse is talking to you about the football game yesterday. Distracting you. It's a very common cause of mistakes because you're not focused. So sterile cockpit, what it means is when you're flying an airplane and just say you're about to land in 10 minutes, you don't talk about anything other than the landing. You don't talk about anything extraneous to distract you from what you're doing. That same thinking should be in every one of your minds when you're doing something that's critical. And basically it means don't talk or distract when you're focusing on something important. That's when mistakes happen. And there's lots of examples of bad accidents because pilots were talking about social things or politics and not focusing on flying the airplane and ran into problems. So I also want to talk in the last couple of minutes about a couple of items. One is a checklist.
Ready.
We don't have to listen to the video, but basically, no matter how much experience you have, pilots always use a checklist. When you're about to take off, if there's 10 items you need to check, you don't go by memory, you go by a checklist. If you get into an airplane and you see a pilot go to his seat and just turn on the airplane like he's turning on his car, get off the airplane. Because every pilot, no matter how experienced you are, uses a checklist because that one time you're going to forget something. And there's lots of examples of that in medicine. I also would encourage you, there's a book written by Dr. Atul Gawande who talks about checklists in medicine. And I would encourage all of you for certain things that you do, have your own checklist because it makes a difference. You're not going to forget things. The other thing I want to talk about why aviation is so safe compared to what we do is before you do something, we call it a pre-flight. I'll show you an example, but if you ever go to an airport and you see the pilot walking around the airplane, looking around, if you're wondering what he's doing a pre-flight. He's checking the flaps, the wheels, the control surfaces to make sure everything looks normal because he doesn't want to miss something. We should do the same thing. Before an embryo transfer, you check the name, date of birth, They ask the patient, what are you here for? Just to confirm, you have your own little checklist and pre-flight that you do before you do anything. So the last thing I want to talk about, I can't believe I'm on time, which is amazing. Training. Every 6 months, I go train. I have an instructor. We practice emergencies and normal flying things. And I've been flying for 40 years. No problem. I've never had a major problem. But I practice twice a year in case that problem ever happens, in case there's a fire in an engine, in case there's the landing gear don't go down. All these sort of things you plan for, even though you never use. So training is important, and we can do the same thing in infertility and IVF treatment. You could do scenarios where you just say, okay, what happens if the blood pressure goes low? Or what happens if the patient is having a DNC and is bleeding? You know, go through the training. What are you going to do? And so that when the emergency happens, you have it in your head of what you need to do. And so initial training, recurrent training is something that the aviation industry teaches us works. But we can do it in IVF too. As you know, there's a embryo transfer simulator where you can take a catheter and practice embryo transfers. We use this for our trainees, our fellows use it, and it worked out fantastic. Here's some of our fellows being trained in the trainer in the simulator to practice embryo transfers before they do them on patients. So some final thoughts. I know this was a quick overview. There's a lot more we could talk about if we had more time. But realize that errors occur. Be honest with yourselves and make sure that in your program you have a way of dealing with them in a very transparent, open way. And remember, it's not learning from errors that's a tragedy. It's not the error itself, often. I hope you'll think about checklists for certain things you do, the concept of a sterile cockpit, so don't be distracted when you're doing something important. When you're handing information off to a colleague or a nurse, it's a big place for errors, so be careful. Check things before you use them. That's the pre-flight and the timeout. Resource management is clear communication between professionals and no vague communication. And of course, the value of training and practice when you're trying to get yourself in a position where you'll be ready when things don't go right. So the only real mistake is the one for which we learn nothing. And we all are human, we all make mistakes, and controlling them and learning from them is the most important thing. Thank you.